there is a very aggressive sanctions package doing its rounds in the US Congress, pushed by Lindsey Graham, suggestive of if Russia doesn't get serious about peace, the US will levy 500% tariffs on any country importing Russian commodities. Now, that would be terminal, I think, for much of the Russian economy, particularly, 80% of exports are commodity related. So it would it would be a hammer blow to Russia's balance of payments, its trade position, obviously its fiscal position and the growth of the economy. Now, whether Trump will do that is open to question.
Hello and welcome to the Putin Files, Times Radio's news series delving into Russia, the Kremlin and the man whose shadow looms large over it all, Vladimir Putin. I'm Louis Sykes, and today we're joined by economist Tim Ash. He's an associate fellow in the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House and a senior sovereign strategist at RBC Blue Bay Asset Management in London. Tim, welcome.
My pleasure to be here.
Vladimir Putin is often seen as the man who brought economic stability to Russia. What is the state of the Russian economy under Putin today?
Well, look, I mean, if you go back a little bit historically, when he took office in 1999 as prime minister and then 2000 as president, winning the presidential election the following year, at that point in time, Russia was on the brink of default, right? I mean, it was going cap in hand to G7 or G8 partners at the time, looking for debt restructuring. Putin came in, said, no, we're not going to do that. And actually, for the next decade, he benefited from the commodity super cycle. I mean, that was the big kind of win for Putin. And I guess G7 gave him the benefit of the doubt. I guess he won friends in the West. Remember, 9/11 had just happened over that period. Putin was, helped the Americans in many respects. He allowed them to intervene in Afghanistan through Central Asia. That was a natural sphere of influence from the Russians. And, the West kind of welcomed him in. He was seen as a global team player, right? And as I said, the Russian economy prospered. Things began to go a little bit in a reverse direction. I guess around the time, we saw stresses in the geopolitical relationship between Russia and the West. I mean, invasion of Georgia. We then saw the demonstrations in Moscow in 2011. Putin thought they were kind of a State Department kind of construct. And then obviously we saw 2013, 14, annexation of Crimea, Euromaidan 13, 14, annexation of Crimea, Russia's intervention in Donbass. And then we had those sanctions put in place, right? And actually, interestingly, in the period up to that, Russia had been very conventional, I guess, in economic policy. Putin always hired technocrats, very capable people, typically Western trained. Many of them worked in international investment banks. He hired top quality people and adopted kind of very orthodox policy, right? I mean, you couldn't really criticize, I guess, monetary and fiscal policy in Russia at the time. They created a sovereign wealth fund. I mean, again, they had a fiscal rule. It was all very, very good, right? And then actually what happened, I think, after the annexation of Crimea, Putin was surprised by sanctions. From that point on, I think we saw, I called it Fortress Russia economic policy settings, right? I mean, you saw policy that probably seemed a bit strange compared to Russia's macro balance sheets, right? Policy was overly tight fiscal, tight monetary. Putin kind of went for lower growth, perhaps, than, might have been suggested by, the balance sheet. And I mean that by how much, debt, public sector debt, GDP, external debt, GDP, fiscal balance, current account balance, all those kind of things. And I call it Fortress Russia economic policy settings because I think at that point in time, Putin knew there was going to be a big confrontation with the West, right? I think he knew there was going to be an invasion of Ukraine, ultimately a war with Ukraine. And he knew there was going to be much more aggressive Western sanctions. And so he deleveraged the Russian economy, right? Reduced debt, built up foreign exchange reserves, built up lots of buffers for the battle with the West that was going to come. And obviously, post the invasion, the full-scale invasion, and then the imposition of aggressive sanctions, everyone's been surprised at the durability of the Russian economy. Well, the durability was there because he made this about that this big turnaround from 2014 onwards, as I said, built up buffers, ran very cautious policy, sacrificed growth to reduce vulnerability. Remember, when economies grow very fast, typically what happens is they build up debt and leverage. And the debt and leverage would be to the West. Actually, Russia would have been borrowing from international capital markets and particularly Western investors. And he wanted to reduce that vulnerability. So we saw that shift in policy, I think, from 14 onwards, and probably before, actually, in reality.
Raw materials have always been key to the Russian economy, really, haven't they? We're now hearing that coal production is down, and Finance Minister Anton Silanov, who I'd like to come back to in a bit, is now saying he's considering changing the oil cut-off price. What does that mean, and what happens to the Russian economy when raw materials start to take a dip?
Well, I guess in the end, it probably reflects a lack of investment in those sectors, or that sector, coal, oil, etc., as a reflection of sanctions, right? I mean, in the end, Russia's been cut off from international capital markets. It has been starved of financing resources, access to international technology in particular. So I guess eventually, inevitably, production was going to slow, or growth in commodity production was going to slow.
And Europe has now in part followed up its threat to bring in more sanctions after there wasn't a ceasefire reached last month. Will that have an impact, though?
Well, look, I mean, one of the problems, I guess, with this latest European sanctions package is the Europeans were hoping the Americans would join in on them, right? Double up, increase their impact. And actually, Trump backed off. I mean, Trump was promising aggressive sanctions if Trump didn't come to Istanbul, talk peace with Zelensky. I mean, Putin didn't turn up, sent a low-level delegation, and really wasn't serious about peace talks at all. And Trump did nothing, right? So we still don't know where the Americans stand. There is a very aggressive sanctions package doing its rounds in the US Congress, pushed by Lindsey Graham, suggestive of if Russia doesn't get serious about peace, the US will levy 500% tariffs on any country importing Russian commodities. Now, that would be terminal, I think, for much of the Russian economy, particularly, 80% of exports are commodity related. So it would it would be a hammer blow to Russia's balance of payments, its trade position, obviously its fiscal position and the growth of the economy. Now, whether Trump will do that is open to question. Done nothing so far. Seems to be a bit scared of Putin, to be honest. Doesn't really want to get into confrontation with Putin. I think everything we're seeing is Trump would rather just do business with Russia. That's what it's all about. So, yes, I mean, European sanctions imposed, they kind of keep the status quo. Remember, Russia always is trying to get around sanctions. So, you've always got to be doing, it's active. You've got to keep doing stuff. Keep closing loopholes because the Russians will find ways to get around them. So I guess that's what the European sanctions were all about. But ultimately, Europe is looking for the US for leadership on sanctions, and again, looking to Lindsey Graham's sort of tariff proposal. And we saw actually how effective that kind of tariff threats were from the US administration. Obviously, we've been in this sort of tariff war scenario, and shock and awe from countries subject to tariffs, etc. So the hope is that Trump will get serious, levy some significant sanctions on Russia, and force Putin to the negotiating table. I doubt Trump will get serious, and I don't think Putin's serious about peace talks.
As part of that European package, I don't want to come on to the Americans in a moment, but as part of the European package, there was in there an attempt to tighten some of the targeting on the Russian shadow fleet. How crucial has that shadow fleet been for Putin in maintaining his war economy? And can Europe effectively target it, or is that just a cat and mouse game that could go on forever?
Well, look, remember, we had this oil price cap, it was effective initially. So Russia couldn't, our country or third parties couldn't buy Russian oil at, I think it was $60 a barrel at the time, couldn't buy oil at less than that price, right? And it forced Urals oil prices lower. But then Russia found, remember, it's third countries and ships and insurance companies, again, couldn't help Russia. export oil at higher than that price, right? But then Russia, as you said, figured out ways to get around it. It created a shadow fleet. It created its whole insurance kind of infrastructure. But I mean, there's lots more ways to tighten up and get, ensure compliance by Russia, as you mentioned, sanctioning more of that shadow fleet, sanctioning the facilitators. Russia can't get around the sanctions and using these sort of third-party insurers, without people helping it, enablers. And I'm afraid we just haven't done enough to sanction the enablers and impose a price on the enablers that have helped Russia get around sanctions. So we need to do just more of it, right? We know who they are, where they are. We just need to be more aggressive, really, in what we do.
And, one of those big enablers, of course, is China. How much has Russia come to rely on them for economic support, if not outright military support? And are the Chinese just doing that in good faith? Do they genuinely believe they've just got the same beliefs and strategic goals as Russia? Or, are they going to come asking one day for repayment?
Well, actually, I take a slightly different view. I mean, I think the Chinese have been pretty careful, right? I mean, a lot of people focus on, this partnership with no limits. That's this alliance that was signed just before, or at the Beijing Winter Olympics, just before the invasion. And the assumption had been that, China would come in behind the Russians and provide full support for Russia through this invasion. The reality has not been that. And I think the Chinese have been very, very careful to, and I think, not to go overboard in providing military equipment to Russia. The fact that Russia has to go to North Korea and Iran for munitions suggests the Chinese are actually not providing as much as they'd want. And also they haven't really provided much in terms of financing. They've bought cheap Russian commodities at knocked down prices to exploit Russia, if anything. But they haven't, I think, gone overboard to support Russia because their number one relationship is really not with Russia, it's with the Americans, right? And certainly during the Biden administration, the Chinese were very, very eager, not to make that relationship worse than it already was, right? They hope to show the Americans that, look, we're not, we could do a lot more to support the Russians, we're not. Please don't be that aggressive in terms of your tariff policy towards us. And with the Trump administration, we're going to see where that goes. I think the Chinese are still nervous about doing too much to support the Russians. Again, they don't want to be, well, they have already been at the brunt of some of Trump's sort of tariffs. They don't want to get much more. I mean, they're just waiting and thinking. The other thing for the Chinese, I think, and we've got shifting geopolitical sands. We have this remarkable situation where Trump seems to be dumping Europe in favor of Russia to go after China, right? This idea of a reverse Nixonian. Remember, Nixon tried to, reached out to China to screw the Russians, or the Soviet Union at the time. This Trump administration seems to be reaching out to Russia to screw the Chinese. And I think the Chinese are kind of looking at this, not quite sure how to react, don't want to make things worse by doing more to help the Russians particularly. And also notable that, they see opportunity in Europe, this chasm that's opened up between the US and Europe. The Chinese maybe think, this is an opportunity. The Europeans may now need us against the Russians. So again, they're being a bit careful there. So I don't think it's fair to say that the Chinese have kind of written blank checks for the Russians or gone overboard in terms of military supplies. They've sought to exploit Russian weakness and profit from it. And they've sought to take leverage because of the war in their relationship with the Americans, right? But they've tried to navigate a fairly, a narrow pass in all this.
And I want to come on to the US now, because there is this kind of almost two-headed approach that is going on in America, inside and outside the White House. As you mentioned before, there's this US third-party sanctions bill that's in Congress at the moment, I believe, that you've mentioned there. How closely are the Kremlin going to be watching that? And what sort of damage could it do at home, do you think?
Look, I mean, if the 500% tariffs are imposed on Russia, it will be devastating for the Russian economy. Devastating, right? For the ruble, for the balance of payments, as I mentioned, right? So, but I mean, the reality is no one really knows, what Trump is going to do, right? I mean, I don't think Lindsey Graham and the Republicans in Congress will push this through if Trump doesn't want it, right? So they're kind of giving him options, but Lindsey Graham, seems to be suggesting he's no friend of Russia and seems, he's been to Ukraine many times, suggesting support of Ukraine. But is anyone really willing to go against Trump here? Are Republicans in Congress willing to push this through, pass these bills or this bill, even if Trump doesn't want it? I'm not sure. I don't think they seem to have. They don't strike me as having. What's the word I'm looking for want of another word, balls on this issue. And in the end, Trump seems pretty soft on Russia.
And as you say, there's, like I said, the other side to this is Trump's repeatedly flaunted the idea of what he calls big deals if he can end the war in Ukraine. But does Russia want these big deals or even really need big deals with Trump?
Look, you have to remember here, what does Putin want, right? Putin wakes up every morning, and he has done for the last 10 years, thinking, how can I screw Ukraine? Right. The number one thing for him is getting Ukraine back. Right. It's kind of integral to his view of Russia, its place in the world. He's said many times, the biggest catastrophe in the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union, the loss of Ukraine. Right. It's how he sees Russian identity. Right. So, giving him some kind of trade deal, I don't think really touches the sides. Right. I think Putin now, because of Trump's weakness, I think Putin sees an opportunity to get everything that he wants, which is the whole of Ukraine. He wants strategic and political control over Ukraine. And if he doesn't get that, he wants what's left of Ukraine to fail, right? And I think I've been on your podcast previously, and I've argued that, look, there was an opportunity for a peace deal here. Trump had leverage. He could have increased sanctions on Russia, increased arms supplies to Ukraine, lots of things to negotiate around, NATO membership, bilateral security guarantees, territory, all those kind of things, right? And in the end, Trump and his team gave Putin everything, right? No NATO, no US bilateral security guarantee. Russia can keep 5 territories. America even de jure legally accepts the loss of Crimea. Putin couldn't believe his luck, right? I mean, he never imagined in any deal with the US leader he could get all those things. And now he's thinking to himself, actually, Trump's weak. In the end, if I just play hard to get and continue the war, I can get everything, which is, again, the whole of Ukraine, right? So he's no interest at all in talking. That's the reality. And it's Trump's mistake. Trump has mismanaged these negotiations. And I think he recognized that. Remember, we had the meeting of the Weimar Group, which is prime ministers or leaders of the UK, France, Germany, and Poland. I think it was in Ukraine with Zelensky that weekend when there was threats of more sanctions on Russia if Russia didn't agree ceasefire terms first before negotiations in Istanbul. And then Trump phoned Putin the next day and basically said, kind of went over that and said, if you turn up in Istanbul, we don't have to agree a ceasefire before. I think Putin realized then that actually he can play Trump completely. And actually, Trump there subsequently, I think, after post-Istanbul, recognized that there's no peace process here. And he's kind of given the process over to the Vatican and suggested that he's created the conditions now for Ukraine and Russia to talk, that somehow he created that. I mean, just ridiculous, right? He hasn't at all. The two sides are miles apart. But I think Trump's trying to walk away because he knows he's failed in these peace talks. And he's looking for the next deal. Maybe the Iran nuclear deal might be an easier deal to do. I mean, frankly, Trump's failed on the Gaza peace process. He's failed on the Ukraine peace process. Where's he going next?
So bringing that back into Russia, then, I mean, is that it? Has Putin done it? He's outmaneuvered Trump. He's seemingly separated NATO between, across the Atlantic between the US and Europe? Has he effectively, he might get these big deals and get sanctions lifted. Has he effectively saved the Russian economy from the own disruption he created by starting the war in Ukraine?
Well, look, I think Europe still has agency, as does Ukraine. I was in Berlin last week. What was striking was first time ever, actually. I think the Germans understood the threat from Russia, right? I mean, Chancellor Merz this week agreed for supply of long-range Taurus missiles to Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine's been begging for them for years. I think the Germans recognise that, NATO is on its last legs. You can't rely on the US for the European security backstop. They've got to increase their own defence spending. They've got to. There's this gap, really. I mean, Europe is this huge economy, $27 trillion, or euros, I should say. At the moment, we can't defend ourselves. But with that huge economy, if we start spending on defence, there's a period in the not too distant future, let's say 5 to 10 years, when we will have an autonomous defence capability separate from the Americans. But how do we get there? There's a time problem. We need, in the short term, we need the Americans to continue to sell us weapons. We hope that Trump, if he cares about jobs, he will continue to sell us weapons. And we need the Ukrainians to last as long as possible, right? Because if Putin wins in Ukraine, he gets access to the two biggest military-industrial complexes in Europe. The two economies that are best able to make tanks and aeroplanes and missiles, all the things to threaten us, are Russia and Ukraine. If Russia captures Ukraine early, he has Russia with Ukraine will be a massive threat to Europe. So we have to make sure the Ukrainians hold on as long as possible, and we have to hope the Americans supply us kit to give to the Ukrainians to help defend us. So that's the challenge for Europe. I think we're getting it. The problem is we wasted 3 years of this war doing nothing. I mean, that's the sad reality. None of us, including the UK, really have invested in increasing our own defence production, which is, a travesty, actually. So there is some hope. We finally get it. We're finally moving. Thank God for the Ukrainians. They produce about 40% of their own military kit. The loss of US support will be damaging for them. But they are developing, long-range stuff. They're amazing what they're doing in terms of drones. And Russia really still, it's still not able to enforce an advantage in Ukraine, right? I mean, there was optimism in Russia, a couple of months ago about progress made in Donbass. That's stopped now. The Ukraine's figured out how to fill manpower shortages with drones. We know in this conflict, defense has had the advantage, right? And Ukrainians are now clearly on the defensive. So, I think Russia, the war unfortunately will go on, through this year, probably into next year at least. I don't see Russia being able to strike the decisive blow. Europe will keep sanctions in place because they have to keep Russia weak. The Americans may or may not lift sanctions. Let's see how that pans out. But I don't see a decisive moment for the Russians either.
In that case, if there is still this realization now, at least in Europe, that they can outproduce Russia, will they? Or is there still the risk that Russia, with its war economy already set up, could simply outstrip whatever Europe tries to put in place in terms of defence industry?
Look, I think, Europe is a 27 trillion euro economy. Russia is 2 trillion, right? I mean, 14 times. So if we focus and we have proper coordination, there's no way Russia can beat us, right? But we need to, wake up pretty fast, right? I mean, as I said, there seems to be a change in tone in Germany, UK, etc. I think we get it, but, we have the state of the UK economy is not what we'd want it to be, right? So that's a challenge for us and many other countries in the same position, right? I mean, Germany does have this 500 billion euro defence and infrastructure fund. They will spend that, and hopefully we've realised fast enough. And again, thank God for the Ukrainians. I think their reaction, to the famous White House ambush of Zelensky and the efforts by Trump again to force unpalatable peace terms down the Ukraine's throats has been to rally behind Zelensky. I mean, there's absolutely, the Ukrainians seem absolutely clear. They have no alternative to battle on because their very survival is at threat. They know exactly what happens if Russia wins this war. It means that the end of Ukraine as a state and genocide against Ukrainians. I mean, I think that's just the reality.
And we talk how at the center of this is the changing position of the United States. I'd like to come on to how Russia managed to achieve that, if that's possible, and who were some of the people behind this. I mean, who was it? This man, Kirill Dmitriev, is probably the most famous on this attempt to win over Trump on the idea of deals. What sort of role has he played, and what do you think, how could we characterize his strategy?
Well, look, I mean, we don't really know, right? I mean, Trump keeps a lot of this very close to him. He has these very loyal, team members. Steve Witkoff, in particular, his former Middle East envoy, who was now his Russia envoy. We don't get much readout from the meetings, right? I mean, Dmitriev, clearly ex-Goldman Sachs, Western educated. I'm sure he talks a very good talk, right? I'm sure Putin's tasked him with winning over Putin, Freudian slip, Trump, winning over Trump with big shiny deals, right? And Trump likes that. We know Trump wants easy wins, right? He's not big on detail. If the Russians offer him the biggest minerals deal ever, Trump would love it. He'd take that, right? So, I mean, I think they figured out Trump pretty easily, right? I mean, they know how to play Trump, clearly.
And we spoke earlier about how Russia's preparations for some sort of conflict of the West, and of course then their attempt to get out from under sanctions, have really changed the way that Putin operates Russia's economy, and it's changed the face of his team a little bit. I want to talk briefly about Anton Silanov, who we spoke about there, that Russia's finance minister. He came in, after, my understanding of it is that the previous person in that position, Alexei Kudrin, was dismissed by Medvedev because he criticized this idea of spending more on defense. What is his role at the moment, the Russian finance minister, and what kind of impact has he had on the Russian economy?
Well, he just does what Putin wants, right? And that's reality. I mean, Kudrin was probably intellectually a bit stronger than him. It's whatever the master's voice tells him to do, right? I mean, that's reality. I mean, he's a capable technocrat, similar to, you could look at Namalina, the central bank governor, all very similar. I mean, they're all facilitators of Putin, right? They do whatever the guy wants them to do. They've run the Russian economy, very credibly, very cautiously. It's a defensive economic policy kind of stance, because the assumption is that Russia's in war with the West and is going to be subject to sanctions. So it's been a very defensive kind of policy and strategy. And as you read, I mean, it's with the war extending into 3 years, it's on war footing, right? It's guns versus butter, diverting resources to the military machine. And economic policy has been all about sustaining, that effort, right? So, they're not geniuses, right? They're capable, but it's all about, again, this is the advantage that Putin has over us, right? Everything for Putin is focused on Ukraine, about winning this war. That's his total focus. Us in the West, I mean, we have competing priorities. Maybe some countries don't really understand the existential threat from Russia. We have divisions within Europe, obviously Orban in Hungary, Fico in Slovakia. So we have, it's a fight to keep us unified. Now, obviously, we have a new US president who sees things differently. He's not keen on defending Europe, doesn't see the threat from Russia quite the same. It's a challenge, right? I mean, we should be able to beat Putin quite easily. Again, 27 trillion euros European economy, 2 trillion Russian economy. There's no way Russia should be able to defeat us. And
there's a similar story, isn't there, across the inner circle for Putin or his cabinet? There used to be Defense Minister Shoigu there in his peaked cap and medals, a man who's never been to war. he's left last year, been moved to the Security Council, I think it is. In comes this economist, Andrei Belousov, in a very smart suit. How's he fared in managing Russia's war economy, do you think?
Well, again, I mean, the messaging is Putin's in it for the long term. I mean, in a way, those hires are as much to message us. They want to message us that, Russia can withstand a long war. They can hold out longer than us. They're just going to improve efficiency of the economy and the war economy, right? Now, whether Belousov can deliver a more efficient economy or a more efficient military machine is open to question, right? I mean, the Russian military is still underperforming. Hugely outnumbers Ukraine. On paper, militarily, again, it should be no contest. Yet the Ukrainians still keep surviving, right? I mean, they're much more innovative. They value life. The Russians don't. I mean, you've got to think that eventually the huge casualties the Russians are taking, probably 1 million people dead or injured. That's staggering. Russia's got 140 million people, big country, but imagine 1 million people coming home with either dead or injured, their families, impact there. The Soviet Union only lost 15,000 people in Afghanistan, 15,000. So 1 million dead or injured in this war is just staggering. So you've got to think eventually something will happen in Russia. There will be a social or political explosion. Obviously we can't depend on that. We have to assume that Putin's going to be a bad guy for a long period of time. But one has to hope that eventually Russians come to the realization that this is a ridiculous war for no reason that's costing them very, very dearly.
And I wanted to come on to that as well, actually, Timothy, about the long-term look at this. I mean, has Putin and this group of economists who follow his every word, as you say, have they found some, new way almost of running an economy at war? Can they really just go on like this forever? And do they really think that this won't have long-term impacts, even if they do win this conflict, on the Russian economy? There's talk now of problems with stagflation. There's the possibility that Russia could go into a recession. What do you think Putin's long-term legacy on the Russian economy is after the war in Ukraine?
Well, the sad thing is, as you mentioned, there were signs of strains in the Russian macroeconomy late last year. The currency was under pressure, the ruble, inflation was rising, central bank made some strange decisions. They decided not to hike rates when they should have done last year. And then Trump won the presidency, and I think the messaging from Trump was, very soft on Russia, and they thought light is at the end of the tunnel, right? The ruble's rallied, everyone's expecting peace and sanctions evasion. There's euphoria, really, and that's because of Trump and Trump mismanaging the relationship with Russia and peace talks. I think, the ruble, I think people will eventually get the message that the war's not ending very quickly. I think the ruble probably will go back to weakening. I said European sanctions will remain in place and the war will continue to exert losses on the Russian economy and Russian people. So, you mentioned, is there some miracle here? The reality is if you look at sanctioned economies, whether that's Saddam Hussein, it's Venezuela, it's Cuba, North Korea, they find ways to get around sanctions. They find ways to bribe people internationally to help them trade. They divert resources from consumption to defense spending or security. They do. Economies survive and function, right? It doesn't mean they're necessarily great places to be, and there are stresses in those economies, and eventually things do buckle, right? And I think I don't think Russia can survive a war forever, right? And but unfortunately, we are not imposing big enough costs on Russia, and we have leverage. We're not using it. The Trump administration had all the cards, as I said. Trump failed to use them, took the foot off Putin's throat, and Putin, thinks things are great, right? Thinks he's going to be the winner because Trump's very weak. Europe will eventually give in, but the Ukrainians won't. I mean, they're very, very resilient. So that's the challenge for Putin still is the Ukrainians, right? I mean, what an incredible people. 40 million versus 140. We all thought they were finished in the first few weeks after the invasion. 3 years later, they survived. Now, they survived not really because we've been providing them with kit. I mean, we've been providing grudgingly with kit, often too late. They survived because of their own bravery and ingenuity, innovation, all those kind of things. And they're still there, right? So, and how is Putin going to win over that population?